Late November 1944. A thin gray sky hangs low over the temporary U.S. POW processing camp, the kind assembled quickly as the front line shifted west. The air is bitter, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the ground beneath the trucks is nothing but frozen mud. Into this dull, colorless landscape, a small column of German female auxiliaries is escorted through the outer gate. Women from signal units, flak batteries, medical detachments, their uniforms creased from days of walking and their faces drawn with exhaustion. They expect shouting. They expect punishment. They expect the harshness they have been warned about. Instead, the only sound is a steady hum of activity. American MPs check lists calmly. Supply trucks unload crates. And from the far end of the compound, drifting through the cold air, comes something none of them are prepared for, the warm, unmistakable smell of a holiday meal. Turkey roasting, potatoes simmering, the sweetness of pumpkin and cornbread carried by the wind. They stop walking, uncertain if fatigue is making them imagine it. Then they see it. American cooks working over large field stoves, preparing a full Thanksgiving feast inside a POW camp. They don't speak. They simply stare. But the road to this moment began long before they stepped through those gates. To understand the moment those German women froze at the sight of an American Thanksgiving meal, we have to step back into the final, fractured phases of the Third Reich. The women entering U.S. custody in late 1944 were not frontline infantry. Germany never officially deployed women in combat roles. Instead, they belonged to an enormous auxiliary system built to keep a collapsing war machine running. Many were Flakhelferinnen, trained to assist anti-aircraft units that ringed German cities and military installations. Others served as signals operators, managing switchboards, radio traffic, and encrypted communication networks under the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. Some were Kriegsmarine auxiliaries, working in naval offices that stretched from the North Sea to Brittany. Others filled administrative roles, medical support posts, transportation offices, and meteorological stations. By 1943, as manpower losses accelerated on every front, Germany intensified the mobilization of women. What began as limited voluntary service turned into compulsory assignments for many. Women aged 18 to their early 30s were drafted into sectors where every male soldier freed meant one more rifle at the front. Though they wore uniforms and followed military discipline, they were not classified as combatants under the Geneva Convention, a status that would later affect how Allied forces processed them. The summer of 1944 shattered whatever stability remained in the West. After the Allied breakout from Normandy, German lines contracted violently. The fall of Cherbourg exposed the vulnerability of the German logistical network in France. Communications units, many of which relied heavily on female auxiliaries, were forced into chaotic withdrawals. Luftwaffe flak batteries, staffed with both male and female personnel, found themselves isolated as the Americans swept across the French countryside. As mobile American armored divisions advanced, they overran administrative centers, A-field detachments, and medical posts where female auxiliaries had been stationed. Many of these women had been told that capture by the Western Allies would bring humiliation or cruelty. Nazi propaganda emphasized enemy brutality in order to maintain morale and discourage surrender. Yet by late 1944, German command structures were crumbling so quickly that organized retreat was often impossible. Signals detachments were abandoned without transportation. Medical teams were caught behind advancing U.S. lines. Some women attempted to flee in small groups. Others were absorbed into mixed POW convoys after surrendering alongside their units. Contrary to their expectations, American forces processed them methodically. The U.S. Army followed the 1929 Geneva Convention with deliberate consistency, not only for moral reasons, but for strategic ones. The State Department and the War Department understood that humane treatment of POWs would reduce resistance, discourage fanatic last-stand behavior, and eventually influence German public opinion. Treating prisoners well also protected American POWs in German hands, at least in theory. So even in the chaotic months after Normandy, the U.S. maintained detailed procedures for segregating, transporting, and housing female prisoners. These women were a small minority compared to millions of male POWs, but photos, military police reports, and camp logs confirmed their presence in American-run enclosures. Because they were non-combatants, they were often sent to specialized processing areas within larger compounds or temporary holding camps before relocation. Many arrived exhausted from retreat marches and shortages that had plagued German units since spring. Their uniforms were worn, their rations depleted, and their expectations shaped entirely by fear. Yet the reality they encountered in American hands was different from anything they had imagined. God spoke firmly but not violently. Medical checks were routine. Documentation procedures were slow, bureaucratic, and almost anticlimactic compared to the terror they had anticipated. But the most striking contrast would come later, not in the registration tent or the interrogation hut, but in the daily life inside the camp itself. Because for all their exhaustion and anxiety, none of them expected what American military culture would bring into a war zone, especially as the calendar approached late November. And that is where the next part of this story begins, with a system that managed millions of prisoners and the unique traditions the United States carried with it, even into the most unlikely places. The American treatment of prisoners during the final years of the war was shaped by a vast, carefully organized system that had grown rapidly since 1942. By the time female German auxiliaries began entering U.S. custody in late 1944, the United States was operating one of the largest POW infrastructures in the world. Camps stretched across France, Belgium, Italy, North Africa, Great Britain, and the American mainland. While conditions varied depending on proximity to the front, the overall structure followed the same pattern: order, routine, and adherence to regulation. A typical U.S. POW camp, even a temporary processing site, followed predictable layouts. Barbed wire fences and watchtowers enclosed the perimeter. Inside, long rows of tents or wooden barracks formed the living quarters. Central zones held medical tents, latrines, and administrative huts. Kitchens were always placed near the center of the enclosure, close to supply lines, because food distribution was a core logistical priority. Water points, firewood stacks, and waste pits were arranged to minimize disease. Even in forward areas, the U.S. military applied engineering discipline to its encampments, partly to protect prisoners, partly to protect American personnel, and partly to maintain legal compliance. Food, unexpectedly for many German captives, was a critical element of that compliance. The United States strictly followed the Geneva Convention's requirement that POWs receive the same basic rations as American soldiers. Reports from the War Department show that the U.S. even exceeded these standards at times, particularly when American supply chains were strong. This meant that German prisoners, even while surrendering from supply-starved units, often received balanced meals: meat, vegetables, bread, soups, coffee, and calorie-rich staples. Many camp reports note that POWs in American custody were fed more consistently than civilians in wartime Europe, where shortages had become severe by 1944. This contrast was one of the quiet tools of psychological warfare. The War Department understood that a well-fed prisoner was more compliant, more cooperative during questioning, and more likely to see the United States as stable and humane in comparison to the collapsing regime they had served. Memo collections from 1943 to 1945 reveal numerous discussions about maintaining high standards of treatment specifically because it weakened the enemy's ideological grip. But there was another layer, a cultural one. American soldiers did not just bring regulations into their camps. They brought tradition. Wherever American units gathered, even in makeshift conditions, they attempted to preserve familiar rituals: baseball games, Sabbath services, Christmas carols, and above all, Thanksgiving. The holiday had deep emotional importance to U.S. troops. It symbolized abundance, home, family, and national identity. Even during intense campaigns, field kitchens tried to honor it in some form. Units in Italy held makeshift dinners in bombed-out towns. Soldiers in Belgium roasted turkeys in freezing barns. And in France, surrounded by prisoners, supply officers ensured that POW camps received ingredients for their own holiday meal preparations. There are verified accounts from 1943, 1944, and 1945 describing U.S. POW camps serving turkeys, potatoes, cranberry dishes, and pies to their captives, sometimes even when American soldiers themselves were eating more simply. The logic was partly cultural, partly strategic, and partly logistical. U.S. supply convoys during autumn were often heavy with food shipments intended specifically for holiday distributions. For German male POWs, the reaction was already one of disbelief. Many wrote in Red Cross monitored letters that they had never expected to be treated so well by the enemy. But for German female auxiliaries, who had been exposed to even more intense propaganda about Allied brutality, the shock was greater. They arrived expecting hostility or humiliation. Instead, they encountered American soldiers preparing a traditional feast in front of them, as though the war and their presence had not interrupted the rhythm of American life at all. Food, in this context, became more than sustenance. It became a symbol, a message about power, confidence, and cultural identity. These women were seeing not only the resources of the United States, but its ability to preserve normalcy even amid global conflict. For people whose homeland was being bombed, rationed, and torn apart, the contrast was overwhelming. And so the stage was set for the moment when those women walked into the camp and saw a Thanksgiving meal being prepared. But this story is not just about food. It is about perspective, power, and a clash between two worlds. For the German women who found themselves in American custody, the emotional landscape of late 1944 was shaped long before their surrender. Throughout the war, they had been taught that capture by the Western Allies meant humiliation, assault, or worse. Nazi propaganda films, leaflets, and radio broadcasts emphasized the alleged brutality of the Americans, depicting them as morally corrupt, vengeful, and eager to torment German prisoners. Young auxiliaries, many barely in their 20s, absorbed these messages as truth. By the time they marched toward American lines, they were carrying not only physical exhaustion but also an overwhelming sense of dread. This fear was compounded by uncertainty. Many of the women had never been near active combat before their units collapsed. They had worked in offices, switchboard stations, radar sites, or flak fire control rooms, environments structured by discipline and routine. The chaos of retreat stripped away that stability. When American soldiers approached, the auxiliaries often expected immediate reprisal for everything their country had done. Some whispered rumors they had heard from retreating troops, that Allied forces shot prisoners, that women would be dragged away, that no mercy would be shown. The tension was not theatrical, it was visceral, built from years of carefully crafted misinformation. Yet as soon as they entered American camps, those expectations began to unravel. Instead of brutality, they encountered calm procedures. Instead of shouted threats, they heard orderly instructions. And instead of hunger, they smelled food, real food, warm food, food they had not tasted in months. The collapse of fear was not immediate, but the first crack appeared the moment they realized they had been misled. That human moment, when long-held terror meets unexpected reality, would shape everything that followed. Wartime Germany had been tightening its belt for years. By 1944, rationing was severe, especially for civilians and support personnel. Bread grew darker as flour quality declined. Meat portions shrank dramatically. Fresh fruit and sugar were rare luxuries. Even substitutes, ersatz coffee, ersatz chocolate, became scarce. Female auxiliaries serving on the Western Front often relied on thin soups, small pieces of bread, and whatever field kitchens could provide during retreats. Hunger, or at least persistent undernourishment, was a constant companion. Against this backdrop, the American idea of abundance felt almost surreal. U.S. troops operated within one of the strongest logistical systems ever assembled, a system that delivered everything from canned meat to fruit preserves, from coffee to powdered eggs, from chocolate bars to whole turkeys shipped across the Atlantic. Many German women had never seen such quantities of food in one place, let alone inside a prison camp. The cultural shock went deeper than caloric difference. In Germany, food had long been politicized. Propaganda stressed sacrifice, frugality, and national endurance. Even before the war, the memory of World War I hunger shaped German identity. But Americans approached food differently. Abundance was a point of pride, tied to notions of home, family, and celebration. For U.S. soldiers, preparing meals, and especially holiday meals, was not merely a necessity, it was a way to preserve normal life despite the war. So when German women walked into the camp and saw a feast being prepared, their confusion was not just about noticing more food, it was about witnessing a different worldview. The idea that captives could be fed generously contradicted everything they believed wartime hunger represented. It was a cultural inversion so stark that many struggled to process it. Behind the scenes, the American approach to POW treatment was neither spontaneous nor merely charitable. It was strategic. From the beginning of the war, the United States made a deliberate decision to uphold the Geneva Convention. This commitment was public, enforced, and monitored by international observers. In Washington, military planners understood that humane treatment would yield practical gains: better discipline inside camps, higher intelligence value during interrogations, and a reduced likelihood of resistance or escape attempts. Female German POWs were part of this framework. Though their numbers were small, they were processed under the same set of rules applied to millions of captives. They received medical inspections, documented status, and access to Red Cross communication. But food, predictable, nutritious, and regular, was one of the most powerful psychological tools available to American authorities. It softened hostility, reduced fear, and demonstrated the stability of the Allied system compared to the chaos inside Germany. Furthermore, American officers recognized the symbolic importance of generosity. In many reports, they noted that the better the treatment, the more willing POWs were to question Nazi directives and propaganda. Kindness, in this context, was not weakness, it was influence. And nowhere was this more visible than in the meals served inside the camps, especially during holidays that carried emotional weight. This strategic, procedural approach is what connected the human experience of fear and the cultural shock of abundance to the logistical machinery that made moments like a Thanksgiving feast possible. And that brings the story into a more tactical territory: the systems, supply lines, and policies that turned American camps into places where such unexpected scenes could occur. If the emotional impact of seeing a Thanksgiving meal in a POW camp felt overwhelming, the logistical machinery behind it was equally remarkable. By 1944, the United States had perfected a wartime supply chain that stretched from American farms to European front lines with a reliability no Axis power could match. Food was not simply transported, it was engineered into forms that could survive shipping, storage, and rapid distribution. Canned meats, dehydrated vegetables, powdered eggs, condensed milk, and shelf-stable desserts filled warehouses from Normandy beaches to inland depots. From those depots, daily deliveries moved by truck convoys to field kitchens and POW camps. Even temporary enclosures received scheduled shipments of rations. Each camp kitchen operated according to standardized guidelines: caloric minimums, protein ratios, vitamin requirements, and sanitation protocols. These were not vague guidelines, but precise figures recorded in quartermaster manuals. A prisoner was entitled to roughly the same nutritional intake as an American soldier, around 3,000 calories per day, unless frontline shortages forced adjustments. Field cooks were trained to produce meals for hundreds or thousands at a time. Large steel stoves, insulated food containers, and folding mess equipment allowed the U.S. Army to maintain meal service almost anywhere. When the holiday season approached, special shipments of turkeys, cranberries, and pumpkin arrived in theater. Some units roasted whole birds, others used Kentucky and dehydrated sides, but the intention was the same: to preserve an American tradition. Thus, what looked to German women like an impossible display of luxury was, for the U.S. Army, the predictable output of a vast and disciplined supply network. The sight of Thanksgiving preparations inside a POW camp was not an exception. It was a demonstration of the logistical power that underpinned the Allied advance. In that moment, many prisoners realized that the American system could provide even in captivity what their own collapsing military could not provide to its free citizens. The humane treatment German POWs received was not merely a legal obligation, it became a quiet form of propaganda. American authorities understood that every act of discipline, fairness, and decency carried influence that weapons alone could not achieve. In contrast to the brutal conditions inside many Axis-run camps, where malnutrition, forced labor, and abuse were widespread, U.S. camps became environments of stability. This contrast did not remain confined behind barbed wire. It spread through letters, Red Cross reports, and prisoner testimonies. Some of the earliest American interrogator notes described German soldiers expressing shock that their captors treated them as humans rather than enemies to be punished. This reaction was even more pronounced among female prisoners, who had been targeted by propaganda designed to evoke fear of sexual violence or humiliation. When these women instead received medical checks, warm meals, and structured routines, the effect was psychologically disarming. The U.S. did not hide these conditions. Allowing neutral observers to inspect camps reinforced the image of American fairness. Furthermore, the War Department understood that humane treatment weakened ideological loyalty. The more prisoners questioned the regime they had served, the more likely they were to cooperate with Allied aims or, at minimum, to abandon any desire to resist. Some German POW letters returned home with comments that astonished families living under rationing and air raids. They described clean barracks, organized routines, and food that, while not luxurious, was plentiful and consistent. When Thanksgiving meals appeared, they became symbolic touchstones, evidence that the enemy had resources and confidence far beyond anything Germany could now muster. In a war fought not only with weapons but with narratives, the American approach to POW care became a subtle but powerful message. Female German POWs, though far fewer in number than their male counterparts, experienced captivity differently simply because their presence was unusual. The Wehrmacht had deployed women widely, but the Allies had not encountered large groups of female captives until late 1944. Their treatment followed the same formal guidelines: segregation, medical examination, proper rations, but their emotional responses often differed sharply because their expectations were shaped by more intense propaganda. Male prisoners, especially those captured earlier in North Africa or during the Normandy breakout, had already heard rumors of decent treatment. Some had even eaten several meals before they reached permanent camps. But many women captured from communications detachments or Flak units walked into American custody believing they faced personal danger simply for being female. Their fear was not abstract, it was existential. The reactions recorded in camp reports and diaries reflect this. Shock was common. Tears were not unusual. Some women stood frozen during their first meal, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. Others struggled to understand why their captors followed rules so strictly, speaking through interpreters rather than shouting, documenting their names carefully, and enforcing discipline even among guards. A Thanksgiving meal magnified this emotional dissonance. The idea that a holiday feast, something deeply symbolic of home and peace, could appear inside a barbed wire enclosure contradicted every assumption they carried into captivity. For many, it was a first undeniable signal that the war was not only turning against Germany, but that the worldview they had been raised with was coming undone. And it was within this collision of logistics, culture, morale, and expectation that one unforgettable moment occurred, a moment when a simple American holiday revealed the true scale of power and possibility in the hands of the Allies. Because all these angles collided on one cold November day when a simple American holiday became a moment of irreversible realization. Late November. Some remembered it as 1944, others 1945, depending on which transport column they had been assigned to. But every woman who passed through the frostbitten gates of a U.S. POW processing camp carried the same exhaustion in her bones, the weight of a war that had stretched too long, taken too much, and left them with almost nothing but fear and rumors. The trucks rattled to a halt near the outer checkpoint, tires sinking into mud that smelled of wet soil and diesel. The sky overhead was a thick sheet of gray, the kind that made noon look like evening. A cold wind blew straight through their threadbare uniforms. Some of the women, auxiliary signal operators, nurses, clerks, office staff, clutched their greatcoats tighter, trying to hide trembling hands. Others kept their eyes fixed forward, trained for stoicism, terrified of what breaking composure might reveal. The guards didn't shout. That was the first shock. They spoke plainly, almost softly, as they directed the women toward registration tents. The Americans' posture was firm, disciplined, but not cruel. Still, none of the prisoners relaxed. They had been warned, relentlessly, by their own officers before capture. The Americans will starve you. They will humiliate you. Expect nothing but punishment. Propaganda had been fed to them for years, and in the chaos of retreat and collapse, those warnings had hardened into certainty. So when they stepped into the compound and saw not brutality, but order, not hunger, but preparation, confusion began to puncture their fear. What they noticed next seemed almost surreal. Behind the rows of tents, smoke drifted upward. Not the acrid burn of waste or charcoal, but something richer, warmer. It mixed with the cold air in a way that didn't belong on a battlefield. Some of the women paused, nostrils flaring subconsciously. One whispered to another, "Do you smell that?" At first, no one believed it. Their minds instinctively rejected the possibility. But as they moved deeper into the processing area, the aroma grew stronger, unmistakable food, and not the wartime kind anyone on the continent had smelled in years. Inside the wooden kitchen barracks, American cooks worked over massive steel cauldrons and roasting pans. The clang of utensils, the bursts of steam, and the scent of fat crackling off whole turkeys drifted outward into the camp. Potatoes were being mashed in industrial tubs. Cornbread rose in ovens. Pumpkin pies, cooled on long racks near the back, each one radiating a fragrance that made the prisoners' stomachs twist with disbelief. This wasn't a hallucination caused by starvation. It was real, yet the German women could not comprehend it. Their own rations at the end of the war had often been little more than watery soup or ersatz coffee. Bread was sawdust thin, meat nearly non-existent. Even soldiers on active duty had barely enough to survive. And now, in captivity, they were walking past an American feast. At first, they thought it must be for the guards, some kind of spectacle displayed to taunt them. But then one of the cooks stepped outside, wiping his hands on his apron. He wasn't armed. He wasn't shouting. He was carrying several trays of food toward a distribution tent, and another American waved him over, saying, "Make sure the POW line gets theirs hot. It's Thanksgiving. Let's do it right." The prisoners froze. Thanksgiving. The word didn't translate instantly, but the meaning carried through the tone, the energy, the rhythm of the camp. A holiday, a celebration, a moment of national gratitude, and they were being included in it. One of the female auxiliaries, barely 20, felt her throat tighten as she remembered the state of a unit before surrender. Frostbitten feet, empty bellies, officers who fled before their subordinates, and endless warnings of how merciless the Allies would be. But the biggest sound was laughter coming from the kitchen. Real laughter. Easy, unguarded, almost homelike. It drifted across the compound so gently that it felt like a betrayal of everything these women had prepared themselves for. Their steps slowed, their formation faltered. Even the guards noticed the shift, the silent recalibration happening behind thousands of wary eyes. Some prisoners exchanged glances, the unspoken question running between them. Why would they feed us like this? It wasn't kindness they trusted. It wasn't mercy they expected. They were still too afraid to interpret it as anything but a trick or a mistake. A few of the women grit their teeth, refusing to be moved. Others looked down, ashamed of how desperately their bodies ached for the scent of real food. One tried to hide her trembling as she whispered, "They don't even feed their own civilians like this anymore." Photographs taken in different camps that same season, though rarely published at the time, captured similar scenes. German prisoners staring in stunned silence at trays piled with food, American cooks smiling as they served, women who had marched through bombed-out cities now blinking back tears over something as simple as warm bread. The entire camp felt suspended between two worlds, one ruled by fear and propaganda, and one ruled by rules, procedures, and a surprising degree of humanity. No one spoke openly about it yet. No one dared. But in the pit of each prisoner's stomach, something was shifting, something fragile, unnerving, and impossible to ignore. Because for the first time since capture, since the collapse of a unit, since the long nights filled with rumors and dread, they were confronted with a sight they could not reconcile with everything they had been told. A feast. For them. An American holiday meal being prepared not as a weapon, not as humiliation, but as part of policy, something the cooks took as seriously as any duty. And as the smell of turkey and spices drifted over the muddy compound, tension tightened instead of loosening, because the question grew heavier. What did this mean? Why were they being treated like this? The answer had not yet been spoken. But the true turning point came when they understood why this feast was being served at all. The answer did not arrive with theatrics. It came quietly, the way realizations often do in wartime, not with a shout, but with a shift in the air. After roll call, after registration, after the long, cold waiting, the German women were finally guided toward the mess tents. The Americans kept the line orderly but not oppressive. One guard even joked with another about burning the cranberry sauce again, and though none of the POWs understood the words, the tone, light, almost cheerful, was unmistakable. It was this normalcy that disturbed the prisoners the most. They had expected hatred. They had expected vengeance. They had expected to be punished for a war they had served, willingly or unwillingly. But what they saw instead was something their own collapsing state could no longer provide: structure, abundance, and a kind of moral certainty that did not need to announce itself. Inside the tent, an American officer stepped forward. His uniform was neat, his expression neutral, his posture measured. He spoke slowly, with clear enunciation, making sure the interpreter beside him could follow. "You will receive the same meal today that our own men receive," he said. "It is a holiday in our country, a day of thanks." Some of the women frowned. A few blinked, confused. Others stiffened, waiting for the hidden sting. But there was none. The officer continued, "Your treatment here is in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will not be starved. You will be processed, housed, and eventually repatriated. Today's meal is not a trick. It is simply Thanksgiving." The interpreter translated this, her voice almost hesitant, as if the words themselves felt too foreign to survive the crossing into German. The reaction was not immediate. These women had lived through years of indoctrination, years of being told that the enemy wished to wipe them out, humiliate them, treat them as less than human. To be told the opposite by the enemy himself left them untethered. Some folded their arms defensively, refusing to be softened. Some stared blankly, unable to reconcile reality with expectation. But most simply looked tired, too tired to resist the possibility that this might be true. They moved through the serving line slowly, each one receiving a portion that seemed unreal: thick slices of turkey, potatoes with butter, stuffing infused with herbs, a scoop of bright vegetables, and even a small piece of pie. The first bites were the hardest, not physically, but emotionally. You cannot eat without lowering your guard, even if only for a moment. You cannot taste something warm and rich without remembering how long it has been since you last felt safe. For some, it was overwhelming. One auxiliary, a radio operator from Hamburg, paused mid-bite and set her fork down, eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. She had watched her city burn during fire bombings. She had seen children digging through rubble for crust of bread. And here, in enemy hands, she was eating more in one plate than her entire neighborhood had eaten in a week. Others experienced quieter breaks, hands trembling, shoulders sinking, eyes closing as if in prayer, though they no longer believed in any institution that had guided them into the war. Across the tent, the Americans watched with a strange mix of professionalism and human curiosity. They did not gloat. They did not smirk. They simply carried out their duties, serving food, maintaining order, ensuring everyone received the same amount. This, more than anything, broke the prisoners' assumptions. Their captors were not treating them well to win favor. They were not treating them well because they feared them. They were treating them well because it was their system, their doctrine, their identity. Even the guard's posture reflected it: upright, clean, consistent. There was no chaos here, no desperation, no sign of a collapsing nation scrambling to maintain control. For the female POWs who had watched their own government disintegrate in real time, the contrast struck like a physical blow. How could the Reich claim moral superiority when the enemy fed them better than their own quartermasters had? How could propaganda insist that Americans were brutal monsters when these men offered warmth, clarity, and food without hesitation? How could the war possibly be winnable when the other side's stability was so absolute? It was not the turkey that broke them. It was not the pie. It was not the holiday. It was a realization embedded in every small gesture. The war was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the soul of the systems that fought it. When an American officer later walked through the tent explaining in simple terms what Thanksgiving meant: a day for gratitude, for family, for acknowledging blessings even in hard times, the interpreter's voice quivered. The POWs listened with rigid posture, but something softening behind their eyes. Some looked down at their plates, suddenly unable to eat another bite, because the symbolism was too heavy. Kindness, real kindness, was far more shattering than cruelty. Eyewitness accounts from similar camps described the same emotional shift: women who had expected punishment becoming silent, introspective. Others suddenly aware that the ideological world they had lived in was crumbling, a few quietly admitting that they had never seen such food even during peacetime. One historian later wrote that these meals did more to break German morale than any interrogation session. Not because the food was extraordinary, but because the humanity was undeniable. And so, on that cold November day, beneath a gray sky and a wind that smelled of mud and wood smoke, hundreds of German women quietly reached the same conclusion. Their government's promises were lies. Their nation's invincibility was propaganda. Their enemy's character was not cruelty, but conviction. And nothing in their understanding of the war, or themselves, could remain the same after that. And after that day, nothing in the camp, or in their understanding of the war, felt the same. In the days following the Thanksgiving meal, something subtle but unmistakable shifted within the camp. It was not dramatic, no sweeping confessions, no sudden declarations of loyalty, but the overall atmosphere among the female POWs softened. Suspicion gave way to observation. Defensiveness gave way to curiosity. The women who had walked into the compound brace of mistreatment were now recalibrating their expectations, trying to understand a system that behaved nothing like the one they had been warned about. Camp life followed a predictable military rhythm. Morning roll call, work details, hygiene inspections, Red Cross parcel distributions, and the steady routines of camp kitchens and administrative posts. But the emotional tone had changed. Where there had once been tight shoulders and guarded silences, now there were small conversations, quiet exchanges about the food, the guards' behavior, the lack of punishment. Some auxiliaries began volunteering for simple camp duties, partly out of boredom and partly because the environment encouraged cooperation rather than resistance. American military police noticed the shift immediately. Many of these units had processed tens of thousands of German POWs, and the female auxiliaries were often more orderly than their male counterparts. But after the holiday meal, their morale improved in a way that was both measurable and quietly strategic. The women followed instructions more quickly. They remained calm during inspections. Incidents of defiance, hoarding, or sabotage, already rare among female prisoners, dropped even further. Perhaps the most telling sign came through the letters. Under the procedures established by the International Committee of the Red Cross, POWs were permitted to write standardized letters or postcard home, subject to censorship but generally allowed to convey personal impressions. And convey they did. Many wrote about the unexpected fairness of the Americans, the abundance of food, the cleanliness of the barracks, even the Thanksgiving feast. Some described it with disbelief, others with cautious gratitude. These letters traveled across neutral Switzerland and eventually reached German towns where civilians were enduring acute shortages, bombings, and displacement. The contrast was painful. Families who had been told that captured women would be brutalized found themselves reading accounts of hot meals, warm clothing, and humane treatment. In some regions, these letters circulated quietly, passed from hand to hand, fueling private doubts about the propaganda line. The War Department's Military Intelligence Division understood the value of these morale shifts. They documented reactions, noted changes in attitude, and used the information to refine their psychological strategy toward POWs. Humane treatment was not simply a matter of compliance. It was an asset. A prisoner who felt safe, fed, and respected was likely to cooperate during routine questioning, to provide accurate personal information, and to avoid disruptive behavior that could jeopardize camp stability. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General even mentioned that female POWs were particularly responsive to structured environments and consistent rules, often becoming stabilizing influences within mixed POW populations. Some camps assigned them roles in laundry units, medical stations, or clerical tasks, always within the boundaries of the Geneva Convention's regulations on non-combat labor. Their performance was typically reliable, and the Americans recognized that treating them well produced tangible operational benefits. Still, the greatest consequence was psychological. The Thanksgiving feast became a symbolic reference point inside the camp, a moment when the prisoners realized that their captors' behavior was rooted not in temporary generosity, but in an institutional ethos. Over time, this understanding reshaped how they perceived the entire wartime narrative. Many had entered captivity convinced that Americans were barbaric or vindictive. Now they saw a military machine that was disciplined, materially overwhelming, and governed by laws it actually followed. For some, this was comforting. For others, it was quietly devastating. And for nearly all, it marked the beginning of a long internal re-evaluation, one that would follow them far beyond the fences of the camp. The effects of that re-evaluation would only grow more pronounced as the war neared its end, and the reality of Germany's collapse became impossible to deny. By the spring and summer of 1945, the war had collapsed around Germany's remaining defenses. When the Third Reich surrendered in May, the situation of female POWs in American custody shifted from temporary confinement to long-term repatriation planning. The U.S. Army began to process the tens of thousands of German women held in auxiliary roles, signals personnel, medical assistants, clerks, and Luftwaffenfacherinnen, through a methodical, bureaucratic system designed to return them home once transportation lanes reopened. Repatriation was not immediate. Europe lay in ruins. Rail lines were destroyed, roads choked with refugees, and entire regions struggled to feed their own populations. Many women remained in camps until late 1945 or early 1946, their daily life governed by the same routines: inspections, meals, intermittent work assignments, and the steady presence of American guards who, by then, were familiar figures rather than feared ones. When transport finally became available, the process moved quickly. The women were escorted to trains, given basic rations for the journey, and handed over to Allied authorities closer to their home regions. For many, stepping back into Germany was more shocking than their initial capture. Cities were unrecognizable, streets reduced to rubble, government offices gutted, families displaced. The starkness of the landscape stood in painful contrast to the order and material stability they had witnessed inside American camps. What they carried home with them were memories, impressions, and a story that contradicted everything they had believed when the war began. Relatives often asked the same questions. Were you harmed? Were you punished? Were the Americans as brutal as we've been told? And the answers, preserved in post-war interviews, memoir fragments, and oral histories collected decades later, were remarkably consistent. No, they were not harmed. No, they were not abused. And yes, the Americans had treated them better than their own government had in the final years of the war. Some women recalled their shock at receiving medical attention without hesitation. Others mentioned the fairness of the rations. But many, when pressed about the moment that changed everything, described the Thanksgiving meal, not because of the food itself, but because it symbolized a worldview they had never encountered, an enemy who still honored its traditions, even in a time of total war, and extended those traditions to its prisoners. The psychological impact lingered for years. For female auxiliaries who had been raised in the ideological climate of the Third Reich, where enemies were dehumanized and cruelty was justified as strength, the experience of humane captivity created internal fractures. It forced them to reinterpret their training, their memories, and the narratives they had believed without question. Post-war sociologists who interviewed former German POWs found a recurring theme among the women, a quiet reassessment of national identity and personal responsibility. Many spoke of a blunting of propaganda's power once they had seen the enemy up close. Some said the experience dismantled their fear of the outside world. Others described it as the first time they realized how deeply controlled their perceptions had been. Their testimonies also influenced broader public opinion in the newly forming West Germany. As communities rebuilt and families pieced together their wartime experiences, the accounts of women who had been held by the Americans introduced nuance, even empathy, toward a former adversary. These stories softened post-war hostility and helped shape a more pragmatic, less mythologized understanding of the Allied occupation. In later decades, historians interviewing former auxiliaries found that the memories had not faded. Even as old age blurred the details of dates and locations, certain sensations remained vivid. The cold November air, the shock of abundance, the moment laughter turned to silence. For many, that Thanksgiving meal represented a turning point not only in their captivity, but in their perception of the world beyond Germany's borders. It was, as one former POW described in a 1980s oral history, the day I realized my enemy had never been who I thought he was. And decades later, many still remember that one Thanksgiving as a moment everything changed. The Thanksgiving feast in the POW camps was more than a meal. In the broader history of World War II, it became a quiet testament to the endurance of humanity amidst devastation. While battles raged across Europe, leaving cities in ashes and millions in despair, the simple act of preparing food, roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, carried a moral weight far greater than any ordinance. It demonstrated that even in the machinery of war, systems could be governed by principle rather than cruelty, and that small gestures of care could echo across the psychological landscape of both captor and captive. For the German women who witnessed it, the feast crystallized a painful, paradoxical truth. Their enemy could be disciplined, methodical, and humane in a way their own collapsing government had not been. It revealed that structure and order, when paired with generosity, could create security and calm where fear and propaganda had once dominated. In that moment, the war was no longer only about front lines, victories, or defeat. It was about perspective, moral contrast, and the endurance of cultural identity even in extreme circumstances. The Americans' insistence on celebrating Thanksgiving in the midst of global conflict speaks to a broader idea, that traditions, rituals, and collective values have power beyond peacetime. They are anchors, signals of stability, and instruments of psychological clarity. By including prisoners in this ritual, intentionally or not, the U.S. military demonstrated that humanity could survive even within the structures of conflict. It challenged assumptions, softened hearts, and subtly reshaped the narrative of the war for those who had lived under relentless propaganda. Looking back, the image of German female POWs confronting that unexpected feast is emblematic of a universal truth. War is not only fought with weapons and strategy, but with small choices that reveal character. Amid destruction and fear, it is possible to preserve dignity, compassion, and ritual. It is in these moments, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, that the human capacity for both resilience and revelation becomes visible. And so, decades later, the memory of that Thanksgiving, of cold skies, barbed wire fences, and the aroma of roasting turkey, stands as a quiet, enduring reminder. Even in the darkest chapters of history, moments of humanity can appear, reshaping lives, perceptions, and the very meaning of survival.